I am. Look, we were up there at the house this past weekend, and we were throwing away some stuff, and that squirrel's in the closet. I don't think I'm gonna throw him away now.
The Bachman squirrel.
Bachman squirrel.
We'll keep him around.
I heard that your mother and father had a lot of Indian arrowheads and flakes and things like that.
My daddy had nothing to do with it.
But like drawers of them. That was her thing.
Right there in front of the house. Mm-hmm. We used to live in Kings Lake subdivision toward the dam, the spillway.
Mm-hmm.
And when the water would go down, we'd go out there when we were little, and we weren't very far high off the ground back then. But where we live now, there's 2 islands out there, and she would find all kind of arrowheads and that kind of thing.
When was the last time y'all found any out there? Arrowheads.
Shoot, I was still living at the house. I ain't going out there digging for a rock. No. But we'd find pottery, find a little jar of a rock where they would grind medicine in. I don't know what corn. I don't
Peyote.
know. Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
That's just what you'd grind in it, some peyote. No.
What do you think we're going to leave here that it would be here 10,000 years from now or 2,000 years from now?
I can tell you right now, one of these days, a kid, a generation from now is going to find an aluminum arrow out in the woods. They say, oh my God, the Indians shot these?
Yeah.
No. What's that, aluminum?
Shot by the cavemen.
That's right.
Yeah.
The last man before AI took everything over.
That'd be funny.
Well, we're here for another episode. We got to talking about what were we going to talk about, and I said that CWD is going to be a pretty hot topic that people want to hear about, whether you're for it or against it or believe in it or don't believe in it, just whatever. It's something people want to hear about.
It's going to get a lot of clicks, I can tell you.
What did you say people ask the most about down at the store? Squirrels.
Squirrels, man.
Yeah, so what's the limit?
Man,
what did y'all say?
Talking about CWD, they're talking about limits on cat squirrels.
Ain't nobody worried about CWD.
No.
So what's the limit on cat squirrels here in Louisiana?
8 in Louisiana. It's 8 on all squirrels, or fox squirrels, cat squirrels.
Tell us what a Bachman squirrel is one time.
It's a great big fox squirrel with white feet, white nose, usually a white tip on its tail. They also have a black phase of them.
Tastes like chicken.
Tastes like chicken.
Tastes just like any other squirrel. But my wife, she moved here from Arizona, and was born in Indiana, played softball at Penn State, and went to LSU. Got stuck with me here, so here she is. Our whole family's here, and we used to, when we were dating, I took her squirrel hunting. She was kind of a bow hunter and a deer hunter, but a little bit of duck hunting. But she picked that squirrel up and now if you ask her, hey, what do you want to eat? Squirrel's top of the list. She said if I knew I was going to have a last meal, could choose it, it would be squirrel.
Boy, you converted her, didn't you? It didn't take long.
Did I ever tell you about Lamar, his story with Miss Rhonda cooking squirrels? So my mother-in-law, she's a really good cook. So if you're listening, you're a good cook. Not really. No, I'm joking. But I love you, Miss Rhonda. I know she will all of us down. I think shortly after they got married, he went out and shot a squirrel, brought it inside. I think he skinned it. It was nothing, just a naked little rat sitting there. Well, she cooked it. She boiled it in water. And I think that's the story behind it. I don't think he ate it.
Well, I mean, but you could do that. Salt, pepper, and you boil it up, and then you can cook it again into
I don't think she cooked it again.
Yeah, we barbecue a lot of them. We boil them till they're tender, like chicken tender and not falling off the bone, but where you could pull it off, and then they're already cooked, and you put your favorite barbecue sauce on them, and on the grill, just caramelize it. Like eating chicken thighs, about that same consistency.
I be dog. Never done that either. I bet that is good.
So Lamar cut her off short is what it was. Yeah, she was on to something. If he'd have just let her finish. Yep.
Squirrel of dumplings, you got to boil that. My wife makes a really good squirrel pot pie.
She started the process. Mr. Lamar just didn't let her finish.
Yep, it's his fault. There you go, Miss Rhonda. You are welcome. All right. So we got a new cat here, and I want you to introduce yourself really quick. First, we want to thank you for coming on. I know it was a trip you coming up, and I really, really appreciate it. We ain't got to introduce this cat right here. Everybody's tired of looking at him, about like they're tired of looking at me and Richard. But no, we'll get y'all both to kind of introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what you do.
Okay, well, thanks for the intro. My name's Johnathan Bordelon. Louisiana Department of Life and Fisheries Deer Program Manager. I've been with LDWF for 26 years. Really appreciate the invite.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah,
I'm
appreciate
glad
you
you're
coming up.
here.
Johnny.
I'm John Hanks. I'm the large carnivore program manager, and I've been with LDWF for 24 years. And Bordelon was here just a little before me, but we're like 10 days apart in age, born the same year. And he's always been a very good friend and mentor, and somebody that I could talk with candidly about whatever, whether it was work or personal life or whatever. He's just been a very good friend to me, and one of the smartest people I know. So glad to have him here.
Absolutely good.
His intro is a little bit better than mine.
Yeah, it was definitely better. I'll pay him later.
Yeah, just Venmo him. Yeah, you'll buy a soda.
Hanks
He'll buy
just
you a
folded
supper.
up that paper where he read it and he put
Yeah.
it in.
Exactly.
But no, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. I mean, all of y'all, you made the trip. I mean, bow season opens up tomorrow.
Does.
And Michael, he's off on Tuesday. It's Tuesday, the day before bow season. Michael, I'm
That's
assuming.
probably tearing him up. He's got to come back in there in the morning.
Yeah. Was he at the camp?
He was.
Mm.
He's spending the night.
He got a little drive in the morning then.
Be all right.
So, but you're grinding away, selling bows, getting bows together, all that kind of stuff. I mean, it is here.
Thank goodness.
I mean,
I'm ready for it.
That's what we're all waiting for. So,
Everybody's ready to go.
but we got a little bit of cooler weather coming before too long. So, but yeah. So again, we talked about the Bachman fox squirrel, the Bachman squirrel. We talked about that, but we can talk about anything whitetail. But I really wanted to hit on some CWD stuff because it's like, man, that's more controversial right now than mechanical blades versus mechanical broadhead versus a fixed broadhead. Or do you shoot a Hoyt or Matthews or drive a Chevy or a Ford? It's pretty controversial. And so that's why I wanted to get you on, as someone just to kind of tell us the facts, that it's just, here's the information we know. The science is evolving. I mean, I'm sure y'all are running different data points and tests and stuff all the time. So you're gaining new information on stuff, I assume. So we're not trying to hold your feet to the fire necessarily, but I just wanted to kind of pick your brain and you kind of fill us in on what you know so far.
And the first thing, for somebody out there that CWD, what does it stand for?
So CWD is just an acronym for chronic wasting disease. It's a fatal neurological disease that affects members of the deer family. And unfortunately, there are many wildlife diseases, but this one is 100% fatal and transmissible. And what also makes it a little bit different, while some diseases can be spread from animal to animal, this is a disease that can spread from animal to the environment and then from environment to a new host, a new naive animal. So a little bit different. And because of that, we treat it differently just because of the threat that it poses. But this is a challenging disease because there are many questions that are difficult to answer. The things that we do know are terrible. We do know that it's transmissible. We do know that it's 100% fatal. We do know that, it's a deer-specific disease and it can persist in the environment, just as we said. But there's a tremendous amount to learn. There's ongoing research. There's research being done, not just in North America, but in Asia, even in Europe now, specific to CWD. And they're trying to answer any and every question we could possibly think of. So, obviously the information as far as about CWD is evolving. Also, the how to manage the disease is evolving too, simply because now there are 36 states with it. And as you can imagine, if you jump back 40 years, you're talking about just a few states that are dealing with it. And when you're not dealing with something, you're probably not looking for answers. And with this disease in 36 states now, it's now something that most states, at least most wildlife agencies in states, are having to address. They're having to come up with strategies on how best to mitigate, how best to inform hunters, what can they do to learn more about the disease and its distribution in their state. And that's where we are in Louisiana, trying to learn more about that distribution. We've been looking for the disease since 2002. That's when we started testing. So unfortunately for us, 20 years after the start of testing, we found the disease. We found it in 2022 in Tensas Parish. That was the only place we had detected it. At the end of last season, we detected 40 positive deer in Tensas Parish. Kind of a mix. Most of the deer were not symptomatic for the disease. We'll talk more about the symptoms, I'm sure. Most of them were healthy deer, but our samples are coming from hunter-harvested deer. So we're not going out and collecting deer just for the purpose of testing them. Obviously, if we were just testing sick deer, then all of our positives would come from sick deer. But because we're testing deer from hunter-harvested deer, most of those deer are going to appear to be quite healthy.
Yeah.
But of those 40 deer, I think 8 of them were actually symptomatic deer. The rest of them appear to be healthy, and it kind of feeds into a point about this disease. And chronic in the name was a good question. What is CWD and chronic, that first word? It's something slow. This is something that's insidious, doesn't hit like a tidal wave. Even from prevalence to the progression of the disease in the animal that's infected. We're talking about a disease that takes at least a minimum of 16 months before the animal is going to show any symptoms of the disease at all. So most animals we're talking about after they're exposed and infected, it may be 16 to 24 months before they even show symptoms. But that can be a big deal because most of us, what we know about deer, we know that, deer are not long-lived creatures. And typically most does are going to give birth to a fawn at 2.5 years of age. Granted, some fawns will be bred in their first year and produce offspring at 1.5 years, but they're kind of the exception. And that only really occurs on the best habitats where deer are in really good condition. You're talking about a disease that has an impact, in 16 to 24 months, it's 100% fatal on a species that doesn't replace itself until it's about 2.5 years of age. You can see how that can be a big deal just by looking at the math.
You tell me, if it gets out of hand.
Yeah, and that's the challenge. When we're talking about managing this disease, often when I speak to groups or speak to hunters, one of the things I point out is this disease has many challenges. And one of the challenges is that the effects of this disease are not apparent when you first detect it, if that detection occurs at a low prevalence. So when you're talking about a small percentage, a very low percentage of animals that are actually infected, you're not really seeing any dead animals on the landscape. And I'll give you a perfect example. Look at Tensas Parish. We've had mandatory harvest reporting since 2008. Our highest reported harvest in Tensas Parish occurred in the 23-24 deer season. So in 2023, 2024, that was the highest reported harvest since mandatory reporting had begun in Tensas Parish. Well, you detected CWD in 2022. Thus, CWD's in Tensas Parish, and you had a record harvest. It must not be a big deal at all. And it really just goes back to prevalence. At this point, very few animals are actually positive for the disease. The majority of deer that we're testing are not positive. The majority of properties in Tensas Parish have not had a positive deer on their property. Thus, deer are doing really well. And that kind of lures a lot of people into a false sense of security, thinking like, this is not a big deal. I know states that have CWD and have had CWD, and they're having record harvest. But how many counties and what are the prevalence rates in those counties? Unfortunately, when this disease reaches a certain threshold, then those population declines will occur. And that is starting to happen in the Southeast. But where it's occurring, it's the exception because there aren't very many positive counties in most states. And those positive counties, very few have high prevalence rates. But where it is prevalent, it does have population level impacts. And the most recent project that's relevant to us is a project that has recently been wrapped up by the University of Georgia in Northwest Arkansas. And what they're seeing there is what had been observed in other places and kind of matched some models that were produced. But when they crossed that 30% prevalence, that's really when population decline started to begin. And not only did it begin at that point, age structure associated with those local deer herds really collapses. And that's because they're just not living long enough to reach 4, 5, 6 years, 7, 8 years of age anymore. And those that are typically are going to be positive. And just a huge challenge when you're trying to convince folks to take action when the effects of something are not apparent. It's just against our nature. Typically when we make hard choices, it's when it's the lesser of the two evils. So when you're doing something proactively or trying to do something as a preemptive measure to slow the progression of spread, both within the herd into new areas, it's easy to discount a disease like CWD simply because those effects are not apparent. The other thing with the disease is you just think about from a transmission standpoint, it first emerges on the landscape. If it's in 1 out of 500 animals, chance of coming in contact with another positive animal, obviously very, very low, even at a deer per 100. And but when we do detect it, often the criticism is, let's not necessarily take action now because it's so difficult to find positives. We just found one positive maybe, in an area. But, folks have to realize that positive isn't representative of the number of animals out there with the disease. It's just a probability of detection. So if you're sampling a couple of hundred or a few hundred animals in a parish and you detect a positive, obviously, there are thousands of animals in that parish. If you were sampling thousands of animals, you could say that. But when you're sampling a small subset of the total population and you find it in that small subset, it's really just it's representative of probability of detection at that point. And that's really when mitigation needs to occur. If we're going to have any hope of slowing spread, it needs to happen then. Because if you know anything about deer behavior, deer are social animals, but they don't necessarily interact with every animal in the forest. There are some social groups that form. There are doe family groups where those animals are going to interact. Certainly during the breeding season, bucks and does will interact. Bucks can even form bachelor groups. But anything that would artificially congregate deer kind of breaks that structure down. Now you have animals that would have otherwise never come in contact with one another that are coming in contact. So think about that first animal that wanders onto your hunting property or your hunting lease or the property you own. If you have anything there that artificially congregates deer, how many deer would the infected deer come in contact with any artificial congregation? We don't know. Maybe a few, maybe none. But all of a sudden, if he visits 3 feeders, how many other deer visit those feeders?
Well, let me ask you a question on that. So feeders, let's just say, are several hundred yards apart. Feed trees are not. So let's just say that this same group comes in contact with another group underneath another feed tree. It's not artificial. Same result. What would your answer be to that?
Yeah, the answer there is really just contact rates. So typically, if you're going to have, let's say it's a mass-producing trees or just browse on the landscape, deer foraging on certain plants, those plants even those mass-producing trees are going to be very widespread. So they're not keying in on that one location in 10 acres, 40 acres, or 100 acres.
There's some feed trees that their acorns taste better than others, especially now if you're fertilizing what do I know? All the acorns I've had, they're terrible. But I'm just saying, I'm thinking like a deer maybe, but they have their special trees that there's something to that. They taste a little better. But
in general, 2 things. Those trees, when they're producing mass, they're not going to produce it every year, and they're probably going to produce it for a short period of time. Mm-hmm. And in more times than not, on most landscapes, let's look at Tensas Parish because the disease has been there longest, and it's where we have the most positives.
Pull that mic down to you. Just pull it down just a little bit. Yeah, there you go. That's perfect.
We look at the number of trees in a bottomland stand. So how many oak trees are there on an acre? 100 acres, 1,000 acres, 100,000 acres. The point is those animals aren't drawn and congregated to one point within a 40-acre block. They may be picking up acorns under dozens or even hundreds of trees under that 40 acres, and they're not necessarily coming to the same footprint and same location. So one of the things that we do know is that feeding, at least artificially congregating deer with the use of feeders, greatly increases contact rates. We're not talking about transmission. We're talking about studies that just look at contact rates. So contact rates is setting up a camera. Let's just set it up on a feeder, and let's set it up on a random oak tree nearby. And let's do that 100 times. And at the end of it, let's see how many pictures of individual deer we can identify at the feeders. How many do we identify under those oak trees?
It's the same.
It's substantially
same deer at the feeders
greater.
Or at the, in my opinion, they're at the oak tree too. But I get what you're saying. It's spread out through.
Right. You're spreading those deer out, and that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to spread animals out. You want them to utilize their home range. You don't want them all to key in on focal points, because those focal points where they key in on, that's where that contact rate increases. And this is a contact dependent disease. So at the end of the day, that contact rate, anything that increases.
How?
And contact in this case could be animal to animal contact, or it can be contact with an infected environment. So if an infected deer visits a feeder, that in this case, the infectious agent can be shed. We're talking about CWD, shed into the environment through saliva. So it can be on the soil, it can be on a feeder, depending on the feeding mechanism. And another deer visiting that same footprint, if you have numerous deer all coming to that same footprint, are then exposed to that pathogen in this case.
But it's not by touch or
It can be. It can be from direct touch and grooming, but it would have to be through a fluid such as saliva.
Okay.
So it's not aerosolized. This is something that's going to be in saliva.
What would you say to, we get asked this, I'm telling you, there's people in there, there are some PhDs that you had no idea. and everybody, and I'm one of them too, I've got an opinion. Mother Nature. You see this all the time. Raccoons kind of go through it. They'll go through a phase where, you see a lot of them, and then all of a sudden, even on the roads, roadkill on those kind of go away. You don't see as many as you used to.
Talking about like the numbers are fluctuating up and down?
Yes. We just called it Mother Nature. Has CWD always, we just started looking for it? Is that something that's always been there and we just called it, well, that's Mother Nature taking care of her own?
It doesn't appear to be the case. You can kind of track the spread over time. Plus, we're seeing areas with very little positive animals, and then in a number of years later, prevalence slowly increases, and even some areas with high prevalence now were low prevalence areas a couple of decades ago. So, if that disease had already always been there, you wouldn't have anticipated to see just a gradual growth in prevalence of that disease. Plus, where you're picking it up in new areas, you're able to kind of look and connect the dots of where it would have spread from. So you have an area of higher infection, and then you have these embers that look like they came off of a hot fire that are landing 25 and 50 miles out. And it's obvious that, that's low prevalence areas, but they're tied to a higher prevalence area, maybe 25 or 50 miles away. So a disease that's always been on the landscape really doesn't present itself that way. Plus, we do know that, we've helped, the disease was inadvertently moved just through moving carcasses, moving live deer. All of those things did contribute, some to the movement of the disease. But this disease is not necessarily a cyclic disease. This disease does not elicit an immune response, and there are no survivors. So a disease that doesn't elicit an immune response, essentially what's happening is you're ingesting an infectious particle. It's a mutated protein. And what's happening is your body is looking at it, shouldn't say your body, but a deer, what's happening is if you ingest enough of those, it starts using those mutated proteins as a blueprint for more proteins that it's creating. So you're not attacking something foreign. You're not having an antibody response to that. All of a sudden, these proteins start misfolding. Well, those proteins are pretty important for cellular health and for function in life. And all of a sudden, when they're no longer doing their jobs, then things start breaking down. And that's really what this disease does. So it's
what would a deer look like? Like if you're sitting there, how would you recognize it?
The symptoms for this disease are typical, or they do mirror some other diseases, but in general, this is a neurological disease. So you have to think behavior. So deer just behaving in ways that are not normal. Of course, there's some other telltale signs that are tied to those changes in behavior. So when folks think of chronic wasting disease, they automatically think of an emaciated deer. And granted, that can happen at the end stages. The deer loss of appetite, difficulty swallowing, just loss of awareness. So they're no longer foraging and feeding, doing the things that deer do. They rapidly lose weight, excessive salivation. But in general, we're thinking about changes in behavior. So these deer are no longer acting the way a deer acts. In the final stages, some of these animals are deer that you can even walk to and approach. They may still be alive, but unaware that you're even there. And those typically are the ones we'll get a call about They're either in a yard or a field or a food plot. Somewhere is visible where folks encounter them and then observe that behavior that they know is not normal. Thus, they reach out and report that. Our very first case in Louisiana was that exact example, where it was a deer that was just the behavior had changed. It was not behaving the way it should. Yeah. Of course, after that animal was dispatched and we looked at it, then you realize that, wow, it also had salival staining. It had green staining around the mouth because of difficulty swallowing. It was completely emaciated. It wasn't just behavior, but it was behavior which was noticed. The other things were picked up on after discovery of the animal. And but that's the challenge with this is, you know, when you're talking about the cycles of disease and animals dying off, but the survivors recolonizing, repopulating, having resistance, where you were talking about a disease that doesn't elicit an antibody response. So there is no immune response to it. Whether you're a frail deer or the biggest buck in the woods, if you ingest an infectious dose, two things are certain. You're going to get infected and you're going to die unless something else happens to that animal first. And that leads to a lot of the pushback about this disease because it is slow. And a lot of the deer that we test that are positive for this disease are healthy. They may, if it's a buck, it may have large antlers, it may have great body condition. And then we're telling someone like, well, this deer was positive for CWD. And they're like, well, that doesn't seem to be that bad of a disease. But again, where in that 16 to 24 month window did you harvest that animal? Because if you're in month 5 or 6 or 10, that animal may look perfectly fine. The only way to know for sure is to test the animal. And when we're talking about testing deer for chronic wasting disease, there's currently 2 USDA approved tests. We use the one that's considered to be the gold standard. It's immunohistochemistry. We have a lab here in Louisiana at LSU that is capable of running those diagnostic tests. But the only way to know for sure is to test the animal, and we need the head. So the head and a few inches of neck. We're collecting the retrovirginal lymph nodes. A long word there, but at the end of the day, this is a disease. If it enters orally, one of the first places it enters is the lymphatic system, and it spreads through the lymphatic system. Once it does that, it'll eventually find its way into other systems. It'll find its way to the central nervous system up an afferent nerve, eventually get to the spinal column and brain. Of course, once it's there and it causes debilitation, then that certainly will eventually lead to death. But early on, those early diagnostic samples, we're collecting those retrovirginal lymph nodes because they're the foremost lymph nodes in the deer. So those are the lymph nodes on each side of your windpipe. Deer have them in the exact same location. So by getting the head of an animal, we're able to get the critical diagnostic samples that we need for that. And hunters may say, well, what if I want to have a deer tested and it's a buck and I want to take the antlers? I don't want to just give my head away. Well, you can remove the antlers from a deer. And certainly at that point, we're still able to get the samples that we need. So, those two things are compatible. Obviously, if it's a deer they want to mount and they're going to bring it to a taxidermist, then it just requires some coordination. And we've sampled deer at taxidermists as long as all parties are willing to do that. And that's something I also should mention. In Louisiana, all testing since 2002, it's all voluntary. We don't test a sample without anyone knowing that we're testing. And in most cases, that's because we're asking hunters for the sample or they're submitting the samples to us. The only exception is that sick deer that's encountered by the public, who may even not be non-hunting public. It's in their yard. It's standing there and it's drooling and it's emaciated. And they're just contacting someone because they want it gone. Obviously there's no necessarily consent to test, but that's the exception. So in Louisiana, all testing to date has been voluntary. So we do rely on hunters for that. We do work with some processors and taxidermists, but again, that through them, it's just really a collection point, but it still requires interaction with the hunter to ensure that they're okay with us testing those animals.
Yeah. I'm going to let you get a sip of water, and then I'm going to ask you or let you answer, what is the infection rate on those, on the deer? that when they come into contact, if they walk up to a feeder, like a gravity-fed feeder or something like that, or they come and eat off that good acorn tree like you're talking about, if they lick the same limb or the same feeder, do we know?
That's one of the things that we don't know. We really don't know. There's a difference between exposure and infection, and in the wild, it's just not really possible to determine. The other challenge with this disease is even the ability to detect the disease in the animal. It's not instantaneous. So if we expose an animal today, we're not going to be able to tell that it's infected tomorrow. It just doesn't happen that quickly. This is something that's usually going to take a few months or more before we're even able to detect the disease within the animal. So because of that lag time, it's really just very difficult to mesh those two together. And in the wild, it's virtually impossible.
Yeah. So what about like high fences? I mean, is there any testing or anything surely there's some testing or some stuff that's being going on in like, high fences that we have this deer that, can you test a deer while it's alive?
So you can test deer that are alive. Typically it's just not conducive to wild deer simply because it would require you to chemically immobilize the animal and to do either a tonsil or rectal mucosa biopsy, which is actually lymphoid tissue that would be sampled from that animal. So that would require under anesthesia, a procedure done by a vet. But technically it is possible to do that. And there are some examples of it being done in captive herds, especially in some other states. Texas utilizes that tool and technique where they actually are able to test captive deer that are in a facility by doing just what we described, where those animals are actually immobilized and then sampled by biopsy. There's a chance that it can be missed through that method, but typically when it's done, they're not focused on an individual. They're focused on like whole herd testing. If you had 80 animals and you tested all 80 of them and you didn't detect it, while you know that you could miss one or two, if the disease is there, you would pick it up, assuming it's likely not going to be just in an animal or two if there's many animals in a facility.
So I got a question. So as many deer that have been taken in the state of Louisiana, which is a few, how do we have any idea how it affects a human? Because if there's a chance that many deer is walking around with it, and we don't know it, and it may be something that maybe it's in their body that is stored there for a while, then something upsets it and it becomes prevalent in the deer or what have you. Do we have any idea how it affects us after we've eaten so many pounds of deer meat all our life?
Yeah, at this time, that's been an important research question. At this time, there's no link between chronic wasting disease and human illness. That's something that has been looked at. There appears to be a pretty strong species barrier between chronic wasting disease and prion disease in humans. So that's a good thing.
There's something in us that possibly keeps us from contracting the...
Yeah, so with this disease, it appears to be a deer disease at this time. We may learn in time that there's exceptions to that. And there's probably ways or means of challenge that could cause infection. But just through traditional exposure, that's been researched and looked at, even with primates. There's been some mixed results on that. But at the end of the day, leading health experts, the CDC, the wildlife community in general, when we're talking about resource management agencies, the message is still that, chronic wasting disease, there's really been no link between it and human illness. So that's very important. But at the same time, because of some of the unknowns that are still out there and some of the questions that are still being researched, out of an abundance of caution, if a deer does test positive for chronic wasting disease, we still recommend that, hunters should not consume that animal. And really, that's just out of an abundance of caution.
I don't want to be the first one. I can tell you, I'm with you.
Well, I mean, there's people that they say that I don't care if it has CWD or not. Like I'm gonna eat it. I can't get it. That is what I was going to ask is, would you eat a burger or a backstrap from a deer?
No,
that had
I
CWD?
would not. Just because you're dealing with a disease in this case, and regardless of prion disease, all of these diseases, are in a family, whether it's scrapie in sheep, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, which is mad cow disease, Crutchfield-Jacobs disease in humans, which is very rare but does occur. The one thing they all have in common, granted, they're affecting specific species, but they're all 100% fatal. So with this disease, while there isn't a link between it and human illness, we know that we're dealing with a disease that when an animal is infected, the outcome is going to be death. And because of that, not really the type of disease you would want to gamble with, simply because there is no treatment or cure. And there's really no preventatives for it in the form of a vaccine. All of those things are being researched, though, and there's just to date, there's nothing that's at least peer reviewed that shows good promise on that front. But with each additional finding, you're unlocking a door to the next step of research that was, it may not have been the initial project that provided the answer. It may be the projects that follow that build upon what was learned by earlier researchers that answer some of these questions. And because, this disease, again, has become more widespread, in the last few decades, there's just a lot more folks focused on trying to answer those questions.
Given the relatively low numbers that we have, because the numbers of CWD infected deer, they're not that high, are they? Relative to the amount of deer that we have, isn't it pretty low?
But y'all really haven't. There's no way y'all have. You have this population. Really, how much of the population have you tested? It's a small.
That's a great point. So our confidence in finding disease at a very low prevalence is not great for many areas. Obviously, where we have found the disease, we've tested extensively, and there's been an increased interest from hunters in having their deer tested. So we feel a little better about the distribution and the prevalence in those locations simply because of the math involved. But when you're talking about parts of the state where, granted, we have been sampling for 20 years or 23 years now, those numbers are relatively low. And the numbers from 15, 20, 23 years ago really aren't that important anymore because the disease could certainly have emerged after that time. So it really matters what have you done lately as it pertains to surveillance. So if you're looking for a disease and you're trying to find it at a low prevalence, no matter how many you sampled 20 years ago, it still doesn't assure that it's not there today because, the time from introduction to detection could have been after that effort. So pretty cautious when we talk about how long we've been looking for the disease. It's important to provide some context that, we haven't just started looking for this the last couple of years. We've been looking for more than 20 years now. But to your point, our ability to detect it with confidence that if it's there at a very low prevalence rate, it's not great for some of the state. But our surveillance goals that we have for each parish are based on risk factors, and they're based on estimates of population. They're based on, they have a harvest derivative to them where we're trying to test a percentage of the harvest in the hopes of finding it at as low of prevalence as possible. But, while we have those while we have surveillance goals, I should say, surveillance goals don't always equal the number of samples collected. And so we recognize that, there's some areas where we haven't detected the disease, but our confidence, it isn't great simply because of the number of samples that we've collected in recent years.
That's awesome that y'all are open about that. So why do you feel like the general public, like the hunting community, thinks that y'all are really cranking down on it now? Y'all may not feel like this because you've been doing it for 20-something odd years, But us hunters that are not involved with what y'all do every single day, we feel like it's like, all right, they're really buckling down on this now. Is it because it's that important and is that big of a deal now? Or it's because what's coming or could potentially come down the road that you're like, all right, we're putting gas to the fire that we don't want this thing to get out of control like it may have
nip it in the bud.
Yeah, in other states.
Yeah, and really part of that is we're looking and hoping to surveil so that we don't detect, so that we can confidently tell hunters that we're not detecting the disease in the parish that they hunt. And we're 95% confident that if it was there at 1% prevalence, we would detect it because we sampled a certain percentage of the animals harvested based on an estimated population, and thus we can say those things. That's what we hope to say. We're not looking for the disease in the hopes that we find it. We're looking for the disease in the hopes that it's not there. But we do have a responsibility to the resource and to the hunters that use that resource to look for a disease that has the potential in the long term to not only impact the deer, but deer hunting. And that's really the focus. And what we've realized over time is now we're seeing examples of where impacts are occurring. So we see the seriousness of it. It's no longer a disease in Colorado or Wyoming. It's no longer a disease that, is halfway across the country that only causes issues in isolated areas. We really don't know how it's going to behave. Now we've got examples here in the Southeast, granted very few, where prevalence has reached a point where, age structure has collapsed, population has declined. It's affected not only the resource in those cases, but the hunting community in those areas. And now some of those examples are in neighboring states. Granted, it may be one county in a neighboring state, but now all of a sudden it's not something that might happen. We can look at a place that it is happening. And if you assume that, well, it can never happen to me, but if it is actually happening somewheres, that is not a good approach. That's just wishful thinking that you'll, be spared. But at the end of the day, our goal is to surveil in hopes of not detecting that disease. At the end of the day, being able to assure people that, yes, we are looking, and we're looking and sampling enough animals that we feel if it was there at greater than 1%, we would know about it. And we're not there. And we're working towards that to a degree. But at the end of the day, our ability to obtain that number of samples, result that number of samples, we're just not there with it. But at the same time, talking about the disease, raising awareness, giving folks the ideal that we're looking for this in the hopes that we don't detect it so that you can continue to practice the things that you practice, enjoy the pastimes that you have, pursue, in this case, deer in a manner that you've prefer to pursue them, not be bound by additional regulations. We want folks to take advantage. We need hunters hunting. We need deer harvested. It's very important for our state and the industries tied to that species. But at the same time, we have a responsibility to look for something that poses a threat to the deer hunting, and all of the industries associated with it. And ignoring it really would just be an injustice to the resource, and it would be neglect to the one thing we're charged with, which is the wise stewardship of wildlife in Louisiana that we hold in trust for the public.
I know this. Well, I don't know this. So how long are we going to study this CWD? So this is going to go forever until it encapsulates the whole state. I work in the sporting goods business. We make money selling attractant, feeders. It affects our way of life and our business nationwide, not just in Louisiana. So we're going to study this CWD, and we're going to collect all this information. For how long? I mean, so we're finding a few here or there. So how far are we going to take this? I mean, is this? I mean, I know it's a constant study. I get that. So 10 years from now, we don't find any more deer other than the Tensas Parish down there in Columbia, Caldwell Parish, where we are. You know, we're wrapped up in this apron and the core area where there's no feeding whatsoever.
Yeah, feed ban.
The feed ban. So I know it's early in all of this, but do we see anybody have any foresight to the end of it?
Well, as it pertains to what do you do, I think it's going for a checkup, and you continue to do that simply because it's important for your health. And when we're talking about the health of deer, I don't think there's a time at which the checkup ends. You know, when you quit looking or quit, especially with a disease like chronic wasting disease, there's not an inevitability. I mean, there's examples of low prevalence for quite some time. There's states that have had this disease and had this disease in counties that have continued to surveil for the disease, and the prevalence has remained low. And unlocking exactly why it's done that there and not elsewhere, there's obviously a lot of variables that you have to plug in and consider. But at the end of the day, the end game here is to hopefully not detect it, do things that, slow the spread. Certainly not moving live deer from captive area, from positive areas to new areas. That's something that, our partners with Louisiana Department of Ag and Forestry are committed to. They've already implemented quarantines and movement restrictions as it pertains to captive facilities that are within CWD control areas, even in response to CWD positives in the wild. And the other thing is the carcass movement. This is a disease that unfortunately doesn't need a live host to cause new infections. So granted, deer aren't cannibalistic, but carcasses do decompose. And the one thing that they leave behind is the infectious material. And in this case, the infectious material, the CWD, is going to actually been shown to bind to soil particles. Thus, it's in the environment, it's at the surface. Deer foraging along the surface, have the potential of ingesting infectious material.
Runoff.
Years
Water.
later.
Can water run? You have this pile. Water runoff takes it, moves it. Can it be moved to it?
Technically, the infectious material can be moved and spread. It's just not being amplified and increased. And is it being put in a place at which animals would be more likely to be exposed to it? Really don't know. If it's on the, if it's in the bottom of a stream versus on the surface, really a better question, probably for somebody who's looked in that in more depth than I have. At the end of the day, the greater risk and concern here would just be moving infected carcasses over time, deer carcasses. And granted, if you moved one, the stars would have to align likely. But, we have parishes that folks are moving, deer from the area that they hunt to their home or to new areas or other parishes. In our state, I mean, they're harvesting a couple 100,000 deer each and every year. And some of the, in the case of Tensas Parish, 3,000-4,000 deer a year. What percentage of those deer could potentially be moved to new areas, and what would that look like in 1 year? How about in 10 years? Now, all of a sudden, we're talking about, hundreds or even thousands of infected carcasses that could have been moved, depending on the time at which you're talking about. Now, could any of those have ended up in a place where after decomposition, there was subsequent exposure and infection? And the answer is yes. And certainly the more you do those things, the greater the risk, the bigger the concern. But at the end of the day, those are some of the basic things that we can do that at least slow that progression of the disease. You're not progression, but you're slowing the spread of the disease simply by not moving it in the back of a truck at 55 miles an hour. It's found where that animal lived. And, that in itself, it'll take quite some time for that disease to move from Tensas Parish to the coastal marsh. And you think about just the differences in body size and phenotype when we're talking about deer in Louisiana. Obviously, they're not mixing statewide. Otherwise, our deer would all look the same. They would all have the same rut. They would all have the same characteristics, and that's not the case. And, if we can help slow or not contribute to the movement of that disease, that for the large part may keep parts of our state free of the disease for a long time. And, what will we learn? What will they know in 30 years? And what will present itself then? The answer is if we don't have it, but in a couple of places or 3 or 4 places, that answer will be pretty helpful. But if it's in every parish and it's in a high prevalence in a third of them, that answer may be of no use. It's like, wish we would have known this 30 years ago. Yeah. So, everything we're doing now, we're doing it out of concern for the future. We're making sure that the things that we're doing today are not going to amplify this spread. They're not going to aggravate the transmission. Everything that's recommended, while it may not seem like it's doing enough, it's what we can do and recommend at this time in the hopes that we're slowing this down. And the slow really comes into play with transmission and changes in prevalence. So changes in prevalence occur at different rates. When the disease first emerges, if prevalence is at 1 or less, you'll come back a number of years later, and don't be shocked if it's still right there. It really doesn't exponentially grow until you get to about 5%. And 5% isn't a magic number. It's not always 5%. But when you get to approximately 5%, what's been seen in counties in the U.S. is when they got to that point, it just exponentially grew. Meaning it seemed like for 10 years, it was just 2 or 3%. We got to 5, and I'll give you an example. Benton County, Mississippi, they detected it more than 5 years ago. It was at about 5%. And they're
5% of the deer herd?
5% of the samples collected in a county. So 1 out of 20 samples in a county were positive. Well, 5 years later, it would from 5 to 20%. Well, that's terrible, but it matches what has been seen in other places. When you graph it, and I use this slide quite often, you just see that exponential growth, meaning it's just creeping along the axis, and all of a sudden you hit this point at which it just heads up, and it's just a probability of coming in contact. At that point, you're talking about contact again, but your chance of coming in contact with a positive animal when 1 out of 20 is positive versus 1 out of 200 is very different. And then the amount of environmental contamination when 1 out of 200 is positive versus 1 out of 20 is very different. So if you find the disease, find it early enough, and you do whatever you can to slow that contact, you do whatever you can to reduce contact rates, that's probably where you can buy yourself some time. And that's, at the end of the day, if it leads to no other detections, without a doubt, policy will be changed. Areas will move outside of that were in a control area will be released from control areas. But, that's okay if you're not detecting the disease, as long as you're looking pretty hard for it. So if the two things match up, if you're meeting your surveillance goals, you're testing lots of animals, not finding more disease, then that's a reality simply because of the pressures that'll be placed on, whether it's policymakers or agencies trying to manage and mitigate for this disease.
But 1 out of 20, I mean, that's a lot. I mean, that's
1 out of 20 that's tested too.
1 out of 20
1
that
out
was
of 20
tested.
that's tested, but
Now it's 1 out of 5 years later in the same county. So 1 out of 5 samples in the same footprint are testing positive, where 1 out of 20 were testing positive 5 years.
That's a problem.
5 years period.
Overall, besides that.
And the problem is it's who you talk to. So in Benton County, we got some testimonials, and they were shared by the Mississippi Department of Wildlife and Fisheries and Parks. And it's who you talk to, because it sounds like 1 out of 5 is bad, but it could be worse. But the problem is the disease isn't evenly distributed across that county.
Said it's not?
It's not. So what happens is you got one form where they can't test a deer that's not positive, and they're not seeing any older bucks. But, there may be somebody hunting 10 miles away. If you talk to him, CWD is the biggest made up thing in the world because we quit testing, but we tested a few deer in the past. None of them were positive. We still have deer on the property. And the reality is that 20% in Benton County isn't evenly distributed. So there's areas where it's much greater than 20% of the deer that are positive. And then there's areas where almost none of them are positive. It averages out to 20. So where you are is everything. The fear is where you're testing it and you're not finding it, but it's all around you. What will it look like when they come back 10 years from now and test that area? Will it eventually all melt together? We don't know that. Yeah. We don't. We can't say that it's going to do that it's going to be uniformly bad everywhere. But I think that's some of the challenge with this disease, because if you talk to 2 hunters in Benton County, I guarantee you, if you could find a property where they're not finding positives despite testing, and you get them to talk candidly off camera, just between the two of you, and then you talk to some gentleman where they tested 7 last year and all 7 were positive, it's going to be 2 different conversations. And that's the thing. No one's wrong. Is it a big deal? Well, it's a big deal to that guy. He doesn't have a 3-year-old buck on his property. Every deer they tested, they had to throw the venison away because they don't want to eat it. The reason they're testing for it is because they want to know if they're positive. If they're positive, they sure aren't going to eat them, because if they were going to eat them, they wouldn't have tested them in the first place. But somebody down the road could be 10 or 15, 20 miles away. They're not wrong. The disease is not impacting them. We killed as many deer as we killed. They would tell you that. They'd say, Nolan, we killed as many deer as we've ever killed before. And, we've tested a few deer and none of them were positive. And our neighbor right here, George, he's tested some and he had 1 positive, but it was like 1 out of 10. It's like, it's really not that big of a deal. It's all overblown. It's like, neither one of them's wrong.
I don't know. 1 out of 10 is still pretty high.
Right. Their perceptions.
Right.
Neither one is wrong. They're telling you about their experience and what they're observing. Yeah. And when folks experience and observe things, that's their account of it. And it does not have to be a research project. It can just be simple result. It can be just based on the number of positives they've had versus somebody down the road. And I think that is really what's so challenging with the disease. And now, just looking at something that slowly progresses, impacts aren't really apparent out of the gate. You can have a record harvest in a state that has CWD. You can have a record harvest in a county that has CWD. All of those things kind of lure you into, this isn't really a big deal. And it's not when it's at that point when you're talking about harvest success, if that's what we're quantifying as a big deal, harvest success. Right. But when you're talking about long-term, where are we heading? It's not good, because when the effects do become apparent, there's just no going back. And when you can't go back, now what?
Can unborn fawns get if the doe?
That's a good question. There's some mixed on that. There are some genetic differences in deer, slight differences in deer, whereas no deer are genetically immune to this disease, but there's certainly deer that are more susceptible. Unfortunately, if we're talking about the more common genotypes, those are unfortunately the deer that are. So we won't get into the genetics because I'm not a geneticist, right. But the 96 codon in most deer consists of glycine. Some deer, it's serine. It's kind of the exception in most cases. Those deer sometimes have a glycine serine, so they can, they could be a one of each. But in general, there are some deer that are less susceptible, and all of that factors in. So there's kind of some mixed results, but there has been shown, there's believed to have been, in utero transmission, but not in all cases. So there's some exceptions to that. So it's not a certainty that an infected doe would transfer the disease to her fetus. But at the same time, after those fawns are born, they're going to be groomed. Yeah. They're going to nurse. It all comes like you can't necessarily detect it in that instant. So those are questions that are just so hard to answer. Yeah. But at the end of the day, what's happening in many cases is when an animal, like in a family group, such as a doe family group, is positive. In most cases, the other individuals in that same family group have a good potential of being positive.
The clock starts ticking.
So it's not prevalent in one sex or the other.
No, it's not sex dependent. In many cases, it's been shown to be it's more prevalent in adult animals, but that makes sense. They've been on the landscape longer. Your chance of being exposed is greater simply because you've been walking around on that landscape longer. But in most cases, prevalence in adult bucks has been shown to be higher than does and certainly younger animals. And we really don't know why, but neither group is exempt. And when we're talking about differences, it depends on where the data is coming from, the county. In some places, those differences aren't very far apart, meaning bucks may only be slightly more prevalent. It may be slightly more prevalent in bucks than does, but at the end of the day,
because that's what's been tested mostly?
No, it's
Because
still a
of what they-
prevalence of the number of those tested. So, it may be, like, for example, it could be in 34% of adults. Bucks tested, and you look at what percentage of adult does. So you're not talking about the number, you're talking about the percentage. And often that percentage is slightly less than the percentage of adult bucks.
I got you.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on what I almost texted you a bit ago, and I was gonna be like, hey, we're doing a podcast. So if you need Ian to come grab something, come and do it. Yeah, no, you're good. We had sweet Miss Maya just walk in. She had to come grab something for the restaurant. Speaking of that, really quick.
No, look, she came empty-handed. No
I know.
duck
That's
wraps.
what I was gonna say.
What in the world?
You were looking for some
Maya?
duck wraps.
Absolutely.
So what are your thoughts on at any point?
Wait a second. Hold up. I got a question.
Well, please ask.
In an affected area, like where we're in Caldwell Parish and Catahoula, and how long would it be before that's lifted?
That would be dependent on policymakers. That's the challenge there. There's nothing that says that after X number of months and X number of samples, then CWD control areas go away. What we do know, though, is that if we're able to meet surveillance goals and we're not going to detect the disease, policymakers, our commission being the policymaking body, where all of this begins as it pertains to rules specific to CWD control areas, they're going to use that information, take that information into consideration when modifying the future of those control areas. When they choose to make a move or change is going to be dependent on the commissioners at that time, their internal discussions. Certainly, and they're not the only policy-making body. The legislature is also involved in an oversight fashion. So
we
there
really
isn't
don't
any,
know what that looks
there
like.
really
Yeah.
isn't. And at the end of the day, it's contingent upon two things. It's contingent upon meeting surveillance goals, and then not detecting the disease. And, that would be a good thing. That's not a problem. Because if we find ourselves 3, 4, 5 years down the road and we've tested a lot of deer and we feel that if the disease was there at even 1%, we would be 95% confidence that we would know about it. And we can't find it at that level. And we inform our policymakers are going to ask us those questions. What are you finding? What's the prevalence? Are you meeting your surveillance goals? What are we looking at? And, what they decide to do with that information, I can't speak on that. But I do know that, none of this is forever. It's not set in stone. It's dependent upon the information we learn moving forward. Mm-hmm. And we hope that is the discussion, because for me, that would be what we would consider to be a win, because you're surveilling at a high rate, a high level, you're testing lots of animals and you're not finding it. So it's, at least from your surveillance, it doesn't appear to be increasing within that population, and you're not finding it in new areas. Yeah. So your control area isn't expanding outward, because that expansion would be dependent on positives moving out from where you originally detected it. And that would be those would be good discussions, a lot better discussions than, we're finding it at a high rate and we were just missing it. So we're like a parish over, and it's like you move over and not only are you finding it, but you're finding it in a lot of animals. And then that leads to looking harder beyond that, finding more. And that would be, at the end of the day, the control area is growing. That's not the goal. The goal is not to grow the control area. It's not to place restrictions on hunters. It's to surveil to ensure that the disease isn't there. That would not be the win. That would not be the positive. That's not what we're hoping for. We'd rather come back to the table and get beat up about, we put all these measures in place. We asked hunters to change these behaviors. You've tested 1,000 deer in this parish and you haven't found another positive. They're gonna rake us over the coals, but you know what? That's perfectly fine. That's a win.
Yeah. You're not going to make everyone happy.
No, but that is a win. And for some folks, that may be something that, if taking out of context would seem pretty callous to say. But at the end of the day, we don't want to find more of this disease. But if we don't look for it, that's not a good way to not find out.
That's a
good point.
Well, that's my next question too, though. So I know this sounds counterintuitive, so forgive me for what sounds ignorant, but if we reach a prevalence that becomes stagnant over X amount of years, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever, it would make sense to me that some feed bans would get lifted, and I'm not near as sharp as you on this stuff, and I don't understand it, but it would make sense to me that if those numbers stop growing and they either go down or they just, let's say, for instance, they just, again, become stagnant, they hover at 3%, 5%, whatever that number is. There's no growth there. We lift the feed bans. That way you could get more deer coming in contact with each other. Again, I know it sounds counterintuitive, but you lift the feed bans so you can start testing. I'm not saying necessarily you're not going to test at a higher rate, but you would test deer that are coming in contact with a lot other deer a lot more often. So if it is still growing like you think it is, or you as an LDWF or all game and fish of that matter, you would just know faster, I guess, because your surveillance, it would be higher. Does that make sense what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. The counter to that with us is if prevalence, if we're still able to detect positive and there is not a change in prevalence, that's likely the recipe we're going to probably try to stick with, because it's doing exactly what we're hoping for.
So if feed bans are in place and numbers are becoming stagnant,
that would be a win.
It's likely those feed bans are going to stay.
Yeah,
in place.
If prevalence is low and it stays low, then the resource, in this case the wild deer, is not being impacted, and that's the ultimate goal, is to protect the long-term viability of that resource.
Yeah. Okay.
So did I just understand this?
Yep, you did. You ain't even got to ask it. You can, but you understood it perfectly.
So, do we know for a fact that these deer are contracting this disease from a corn pile?
No, we don't know that. We do know that this disease is contact dependent, and what we've known, not even related to CWD, we know that artificial congregation through baiting increases contact rates. So it's one of those things that what increases the spread of CWD? Increased contact rates. What increases contact rates? Artificial congregation with feeding. And it's like, okay, well, probably start there with step one, and then let's see what else we can do. And, we talk about it. It's not.
We don't want to cut down all the oak trees, and just have corn feeders sitting up there.
And at the end of the day, we'd rather deer just dispersed on the landscape, taking advantage of hundreds or thousands of oak trees in their home range. And at the end of the day, they're not coming and putting their mouth on the same footprint. All of the deer within that, hundreds of acres that you're talking about that surround that, now all of a sudden have a common place to visit. No, they may be overlapping, but they're not foraging and feeding in the same place day after day, month after month, year after year. And that's really what that is mostly about. At the end of the day, those sites can also serve as, environmental reservoirs for the disease, simply because if there's enough infectious material deposited in the same location, then that simply becomes a hot spot. And if that hot spot continues to serve as an attractor to deer because more lure is placed there over and over again, then all of a sudden that environmental reservoir, in this case, is exposing deer that have otherwise not been exposed. But that is the challenge with this disease, simply because transmission can occur through normal behavior. What we do know, though, is that, it is contact dependent, and nothing amplifies contact more than baiting or feeding.
Right.
So you're controlling the one thing you have control over, and that one thing poses the greatest risk as it pertains to contact rate and increased transmission. But it doesn't mean the disease goes away. It just means that you're hopefully slowing that rate of transmission. You're reducing exposure. You're taking those animals that otherwise would have never come in contact with one another. Now they're coming in contact. You remove that one thing. Now all of a sudden those animals are no longer coming in contact with one another again. So it may find its way there, but at the end of the day, you're hopefully reducing the time at which that occurs. And that's what we're faced with right now, is trying to slow that spread, reduce that transmission, knowing that it's not going to make the disease go away.
What were you going to say, John?
It's not a question, it's just something I wanted to talk about, because I talk with people about CWD daily, and you probably do too. So you can't cook it and it kills the disease. Like you can trichinosis in bear. You can cook it done. Trichinosis doesn't get you in a bear. There's no doing that for CWD. And also how long that infectious material persists in the environment, because you're talking about a feeder. Like I've been hunting the same deer stand since I was a kid. I don't have a feeder, but if I did, like my buddy over there, the next stand over, he's had his feeder in the same spot. It's a little bit of a mud hole. And if that disease or that infectious agent is there and persists for 5, 10, 20 years, then how many deer visited that feeder in a 20-year time? And your likelihood of goes up of them encountering it. So I'd like to talk about that just a little bit.
Yeah, I see what that's a pretty good point too.
Yeah, there's no cooking it out. In this case, high heat kind of medical grade incinerators can get hot enough to denature the prion, the infectious agent in this case. But conventional cooking and fire is not going to do it. Again, though, no direct link between this disease and human illness, but persistence in the environment, we really don't know how long, but we know it's years. It can be detected in the environment. There's some sophisticated amplification tests that are used now that can detect the disease in substrates such as soil. It's certainly only for experimental purposes. At the end of the day, we don't call an area positive based on that because it is experimental research, but it certainly is informative. It's kind of unlocking some doors as far as being able to answer some questions you previously could not answer. Some of the early research simply just took animals that were known to be infected, removed them from a paddock, left it idle for a number of years, reintroduced naive animals from herds where the disease had never been detected, captive-wise, and then they followed up and tested those animals after that reintroduction. So they never came in contact with a positive animal, only introduced to the same pen or research facility where the positive animals were removed from. And, even a couple of years later, those animals become
Still
infected.
So how similar is that to like parvo in dogs? Like when it comes to the type
really,
of disease
really
that it is?
Difficult to compare, but certainly there are other diseases that have an environmental persistence component. But in this case, we're not really talking about something that's alive. We're talking about infectious material that could remain persistent in the environment. It's resistant to heat, to water, to snow, to cold, you name it. It's going to be there and it's going to persist. And regardless of whether it's northern state or southern state, it does have, the element of environmental persistence.
But did it originate from the ground? I mean, is it something?
We don't really know where it originated. It's believed that, there was in 1960s in Colorado, in a captive herd, there was something affecting deer. It was causing all of the symptoms of CWD, but they didn't know it was CWD then. And, since that time, that not only is that a positive area, the areas outside of that facility are positive areas too. And animals move from one facility to another, move that disease and those symptoms with them. May not have known what the disease was, it's just they moved the symptoms. And, you believe, it's believed, it's widely published in the literature that, it originated in Colorado in the 1960s.
I did not know that.
Yeah, but beyond that, it's moved to now 36 states. Part of it is what we talked about earlier. Some of it is how long have you been looking? But again, I go back to, it really just matters what have you looked for lately, and just the number of states that are finding it in new areas where they've been looking for 20 years, and states that, like the Benton example in Mississippi, 5 to 20% in 5 years. Diseases that would have been there for 100 years just don't behave that way. It's pretty obvious that it's emerging, it's spreading, but it's definitely not everywhere. And one of the disadvantages, we're not looking at a map right now. Of course, the map would only reveal where the disease had been detected. But when you look at positive parishes and counties, more so in the Southeast, most of the map is not colored, meaning, the positive counties are shaded, and most counties are not shaded, just like most parishes aren't. Doesn't mean the disease isn't there, but it's important for folks to realize, especially in the Southeast, that this is an emerging disease, that in general, most states have very few positive counties. And even in those positive counties, there are very few positive animals. So, doing something or taking some actions now, pretty important. It's not as if we're finding it everywhere, and half the places the prevalence is already high and the populations are collapsing. That's not what's occurring. That's not what we're observing right now. So, it's a very doomsday topic. It seems like there's an inevitability to it, and deer are doomed. But it's also important to point out that many states, including our own, we're harvesting about as many deer now as we ever have.
Hey, look, a deer is resilient.
Yeah,
it's gone through a lot of stuff. It's gone through CWD. It'll make it through CWD. It's gone through, and I'm sorry because I wanted to say this a while ago, but I can't think of the name of it. But in the north, in the
EHD, you talk about another disease.
Where they find around the water holes,
blue tongue, EHD,
yes,
and that's a completely
very different disease.
Very,
so
very different.
Those are viral diseases. Epizootic hemorrhagic disease and blue tongue are viral diseases that affect deer. In Louisiana, they're exposed to it almost annually. And some years, most deer are exposed to it. When we did collect blood from hunter-harvested deer for various surveillance purposes, one of the things that we screened for were antibodies to blue tongue. And we called it hemorrhagic disease. We lumped both EHD, epizootic hemorrhagic disease, and blue tongue into one. There were years where the majority of our samples had antibodies, but those are perfectly healthy looking deer. So, where thgoing diseases have been endemic, unlike CWD, there's an antibody response to those. And the survivors, are going to be equipped to, survive future exposures.
So they can survive it.
Yeah. They have an immunity to it somewhat in the South because they encounter it annually. Where
How
in
do
the
they
North,
encounter it?
Just in the environment. So it's spread by insect vector. So that's a virus. It's moving from animal to animal. So you're biting flies, those midges, the Culicoides midge is one of the common vectors that would move the disease from one animal to the other.
I remember that.
But, in Louisiana, just like this year alone, I think we have gotten a few reports and submitted a few samples, but at the end of the day, it's I want to say a non-issue, but we have EHD and blue tongue every year in our state, and it occurred at times in which populations are expanding and harvest is increasing. The difference, though, is if you move into parts of the country where the disease is not endemic, meaning it's moving into areas where it was not in the past, there is not much in the way of herd immunity. Thus, those herds can be greatly impacted. And often what you'll see is in more northern latitudes where the disease emerges, a strain that previously wasn't there, there'd be some pretty significant mortality. But in Louisiana, while it is possible to have mortality from that disease, typically quite low. We don't necessarily see a lot of mortality from EHD. We don't do a lot of disease investigations of deer that are found dead, that, EHD or blue tongue's the culprit. Again, when we were looking at, just our general herd health that we did from hunter harvested deer that included the draw of blood, there were years where over half of our samples had antibodies to it. So it's like, your deer are being exposed, and they're being exposed to something that they're, pretty immune to. And that's one of the a common thing is, well, EHD and blue tongue kills more deer than CWD. Well, it's all dependent on because if you're talking about what's the greatest threat this year to Louisiana, will we lose more deer to CWD or EHD or blue tongue? Well, the answer might be EHD or blue tongue this year, because CWD is we've only found one positive in Catahoula, and it's pretty isolated in Tensas. So, very few deer are being exposed and being infected, and thus it's killing deer. But, EHD is more widespread. But if you're talking about, once CWD becomes endemic, there's just no comparison.
Well, give it 2 years. Worst case.
There's no comparison.
Right.
So, as CWD becomes endemic, if your prevalence reaches 30%, God forbid, you're no longer replacing the number of animals that you're losing annually. Thus, your population is declining, and it's not coming back up. It's just going to decline for some time.
You're going to reach
until you reach a new base or new bottom.
Of 2-year-olds.
Yes,
yeah.
And
that'll be an old deer,
and that may be at a population that is greatly reduced from what you're accustomed to seeing. So
that's not a pretty picture.
That is not,
and that's probably, you're probably talking about worst case too, though.
And that's only been right now. That's being observed in just very few parts. In Northwest Arkansas, there was a study, like in the study that was done by the University of Georgia in cooperation with the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. In one of their study sites, they focused on an area where CWD prevalence was high. And it's being observed there, but that was the worst place in their state.
Yeah.
So it's not, though, a theory or a model that's projecting it. It's what's being observed, but it's not being observed across the whole state. It's being observed in a study area. That study area is a hot spot. But the unfortunate part is all of us probably realize now that if it happened there, what's to prevent it from happening beyond there? And we don't know what conditions and variables contributed to it reaching that level there. Was it just there that much longer than everywhere else? Yeah. None of us know that. We just know that, what is possible when the disease reaches a certain threshold. But it's not meant to come away with it's an hopelessness to this. It's an inevitability that study site will become the state of Arkansas, because there's certainly counties where they've detected this disease and they've been sampling, and they're still finding a few positives, but the key is a few positives.
Yeah.
It's not a wildfire raging out of control that's resulting in a population collapse and in an age structure reduction, So, those are the challenges. That's the differences. And we just can't speak in absolutes when it comes to this. It's there has to be context, and I think we covered a lot of that, in this conversation, how it is dependent on circumstance, and there isn't just a rule that it's going to behave a certain way, and there's an inevitability to it, and there are some unknowns, but the knowns are so scary, and the worst case is now not in theory, but it's something we can look at. We don't necessarily even have to go halfway across the country to see worst case anymore. Now we can go to a neighboring state. And for a wildlife manager, for me, it does raise the seriousness of it, because now it's not something that's halfway across the country. It's something
It's
just,
just right over there.
next door.
Yeah.
And that does for me, we're talking earlier about, it seems like we're doing more now, but again, we're aware of things now that we weren't aware of 10 and 20 years ago. And out of that awareness, that is where all of this concern and caution was born from, simply because now it's no longer a Colorado issue and it's no longer something that might happen. It's no longer a model that says when you get to this number, this is what you should expect. Now we can look at a study site and see what's happening. And it's like, it's so scary that it's like, we can't ignore this. We need to be looking for it in hopes that we don't find it. But if we do, we need to do whatever we can to keep that from happening.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge, and that's the difficulty. And that's a conversation that you really can't have in 1 minute with somebody on the phone, someone in your office. There's just so much to this that, it's very difficult to articulate a threat when you don't have examples in your own state and you have something that progresses so slowly.
Well, it's going to be hard to explain, and I hope a lot of people that listen to this kind of understand it some more too. But when you talk to one of my people that I grew up with and hunt with and run around with, that's just a big pill to swallow, because it takes away a way of life that I can remember when I was younger, we didn't feed deer. We didn't, a sack of corn was pretty expensive back in the day.
I'll jump on that. My family on my mother's side, all farmed and still farm. I have family on my mother's side that farms. My dad did not, but on my mom's side, grandfather, uncles, cousins, and they still farm. And growing up as a kid, we hunted where there was farmland to hunt on and the adjacent forest land to hunt on. I could remember the grain bin being full of grain. I don't know if we didn't realize that you could not feed because, my grandfather growing up, they really didn't hunt deer because there weren't very many deer, at least where he was. They hunted birds and small games. They hunted squirrels. They hunted ducks. They hunted quail even, at early on, and couldn't bait any of those things legally. And so here we go. It wasn't until I was a teenager, I started hunting with a few friends and ventured into north central Louisiana, which is Area 2 now. I don't know if it was Area 2 40 years ago, but it was then. It was that was the first time I was ever exposed to anyone putting bait out. I didn't even think you could do that. And to your point, but it certainly has changed. And it's also not just hunting. Folks view wildlife. Some of the enjoyment at the camp, whether it's kids, folks who don't actively even hunt, but maybe family hunts. Looking at game camera pictures is just part of what folks do now. And cellular cameras that, have unlocked, it could be something you look at as a family every night. You can look at with the kids. You can look at with your wife. And, there's great enjoyment. It's not that you can't use those tools, and it's not that you can't view. But case in point, set up a camera where there is no bait and set up a camera where there is bait. And how many more pictures will you have on camera with bait and without? And it kind of goes back to the disease, contact, and transmission risk. But at the same time, it's not just the hunters, but it's also folks like, we talk to folks all the time who don't hunt but have a feeder because they like seeing the deer on their property. They like seeing the doe with the fawn that comes on their property in the way backyard that they can see late in the evening, and they enjoy that. Of course, we tell them that even though they're not hunting, we tell them that you can't do that in a CWD control area because you're artificially congregating and you're doing something that would be prohibited. Yeah. And but the point is, it's not just hunters and it's not just to harvest deer. A lot of it is tied to just viewing wildlife, whether it's on a camera or just on the back porch. So you're right. It's something that culturally we've just shifted to. And of course, if you're a younger hunter, you probably don't remember when baiting was not part of deer hunting.
If they're younger than I am, they don't remember not baiting. But two things,
they also didn't shoot does back then either.
No, they sure didn't. That's exactly right.
And you didn't let a buck go by. So it's
Right.
so much has changed in the last 30 years.
And look, some of the biggest celebrations I've ever seen was a 4-point being shot, brought back to the camp. High-fived, hugs, pictures. Years ago in Mississippi, but you tell me if I'm right or wrong on this story. They had something going on. Mississippi was sort of, maybe you could feed, maybe you couldn't, but people did, and as long as nobody threw a big fit about it, it was okay. Something happened to the turkeys. I can't remember what they contracted. They thought they contracted from corn.
May have been aflatoxin poison. It could have been a disease.
All right.
You're concentrating animals in one spot.
Is that the same? That just affected the bird?
It's a different disease, or a different, it may have been a toxin even.
Yeah.
But what caused it is they were all going to that one spot. If if it was displaced over hundreds of acres.
Yes, and with aflatoxin, we're talking about, something that can often be invisible. So the grain may look perfectly fine, but the spores that are on it, are hazardous to animals. And certainly some species, if you're a quail and you ingest some aflatoxin, corn with elevated aflatoxin level, or you're a deer and you're foraging on all kinds of things, not just a belly full of corn. You're picking up some corn, but you also have a belly full of green. Anyone who's ever accidentally cut into a deer stomach knows exactly what I'm talking about. And, certainly they can be exposed. It's not good for their health. And if they eat enough aflatoxin contaminated bait, it can cause illness and even death. But for small animals and birds in particular, they may just have greater sensitivity, but really can't speak to that being the culprit. Often,
so it came from the bait itself, not something left.
Right. So
not a transmitted.
Yeah. So aflatoxin can be hazardous, to wildlife. In general, though, often, we're looking for a smoking gun. When it comes to populations that decline, there's so many variables. Because chances of aflatoxin corn being placed on every acre of habitat where turkey or quail inhabit, it's just not, typically when the impact is widespread, there's something else at play. It may contribute, and if things aren't doing well, because for environmental reasons, if there's some environmental challenge that's making it, in the case of turkeys, untimely rain, reduced, and then you have anything like that can be additive, but yeah.
And it may not have been aflatoxin. It may have been a disease, and it may have nothing to do with corn at all. But anytime you concentrate, if one of us is sick, do you want to be in this room with them?
Yeah.
And how long do you want to be in this room with them? Do you want to share my bottle? We all pass the same bottle around, or do you want to have your own?
Well, if I'm 6 foot away from you and I'm wearing a mask, I'm good. So I'm just letting you know that. So that's there's your fix on deer.
Yeah.
Keep them 6 foot away from each other, wearing a mask. Mr. Black Bear, we haven't heard enough from you. Let me ask you, because you don't deal with the CWD stuff every day, but you're an avid outdoorsman and hunter and everything else. So let me get your hunting opinion on this. What is the biggest uproar that us hunters and outdoorsmen have when it comes to CWD?
I think it's just it's scary, and a lot of people just get little bits and pieces like you're talking about. You can't talk about this for 3 minutes at the cooler. I don't know how long we've been talking here talking about it, but he's got a lot more if you ask the right questions. It's so much information that is pieced together and so many unknowns mixed in it that, I'll just cook it done. That doesn't work, or it's just you're uneducated about it, and you need to educate yourself about it. And there's a lot of misinformation about a lot of things.
Absolutely.
And sometimes you're getting good information, but you only get part of it. It has been in Colorado since the 60s. And we started our careers roughly 25 years ago, and we didn't have it, and probably most of the Southeast didn't have it that we knew about. But we've been collecting almost every year of our careers. Started in 2002. So we'd been here just a very short time before us, and we've always been collecting samples. Now, was it enough? Was it from the right places? Well, now we think it is, but we didn't know back then. And it doesn't matter what was back then. We got what we got now, and this is what we're working with.
Yeah.
And just like any other profession, medical or wherever, food services, technology gets better, people get better. You know, they didn't have frozen food 200 years ago, and now you can kill your deer, have it processed and freeze it, and if you package it right, you may be able to eat that deer 3 years from now. Didn't have that, so we're getting new tools, new information. We got the internet, which can be a friend or a foe, because there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of everybody's an armchair quarterback, and there's a lot we don't know. But we're hunters and fishermen and outdoorsmen too. We are experiencing this with you. We are concerned about it. We want to, keep, something that we talked about when we first found it, the positive, just him and I, is that was, deer hunting was something that was generational, and it went back from families and was kind of a wholesome thing. And, you get this meat that's off the land that's not been, there's no antibiotics, there's no steroids, it's a pure thing, and now it's corrupted because we have this horrible disease that is always fatal, and we don't know this, and we don't think people can get it, but we don't know. We don't think this, but we don't know, and we're learning things as we go. But it's not we're going to know in 2 years. We might be 15 or 20, might be 5. What happens in Mississippi doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen in Louisiana.
It
could, but it could not. And we don't know why. And we'll probably find out. But if we are not cautious, by the time we find out, we may have said, doesn't matter anyway. So little conservatism, extra caution, let's do the best we can with what we got.
I wonder, in a few years, we'll find out, maybe do a study. How did it affect the bear and the hog population when you stop throwing a bunch of extra feed out there on the ground?
Well, just from talking, anecdotal with Tensas Parish deer hunters, when they stopped feeding, they didn't necessarily stop seeing bears, but they stopped having as many problems with bears, because bears, they're lazy. They don't want, to go out in the food plot and they'll go out through there and graze and go to the next food plot and go to that. Oh, here's an acorn tree. I can eat a little bit here. But if they've got a 400-pound gravity feeder and they can turn it over, they'll lay there like a grizzly bear guarding an elk and prey guard that corn feeder for days.
Yeah.
So, if you don't have that, they don't do that.
How much of this is political? I've seen pictures. I just came traveling back through Texas, and I've only seen this one time. I've seen pictures. They could have been staged or faked. I don't have a clue. But I saw on my way back home, I drove through Dallas, and outside of Dallas, I think it was like the Denton area, But right off I-30, I think it was off I-35 or I-40. I don't remember. Anyhow, regardless, wherever I was in Texas. And I saw a CWD billboard. How political is some of this stuff? Because that's one of the things you hear people say is it's nothing but a money grab for states. And somewhere like Texas, when you do see, instead of a free car wash or a $1 car wash at your gas pump while you're pumping fuel, it's a picture of a deer and it tells you the dangers of CWD and stuff. It's hard to believe for us common men that don't understand everything like you to think that it's not something that is just really political, and why are they pushing it like that?
Yeah, it's not political in the sense of the origin of mitigation. So mitigation's origin is coming from wildlife agencies that are, holding the, they're there for the protection and the wise stewardship of that wild resource. So they're identifying the threat. And then they, of course, though, in order to turn mitigation into regulation requires policy. And depending on the state, that can be a commission or a legislature. And then, politics can enter the arena at that time. But certainly the recommendations and the origins are coming from folks who are managing those species. There's no monetary advantage to finding CWD. It's actually quite the opposite. It's bad news for an agency. Twofold. In our state, alone, in the Southeast even more so, but in Louisiana, more than 70% of hunters are deer hunters. And think about all of the things that you can hunt in Louisiana. And there's a lot. And if we look at all the days spent afield, which there's a ton, we're a hunting state, but 2 out of 3 days spent afield in Louisiana hunting is spent in pursuit of deer. You think about, from the economic side of it, yes, there's an industry tied to deer hunting. 2019 was the last economic assessment we had done. Close to $600 million in retail sales alone. When you added the multiplier effect to that, it was close to $1 billion, over $250 million in related industry jobs tied to it, $100 million in taxes associated with deer and deer hunting. And we're just talking about economics of deer and deer hunting. We're talking about how deer are pursued. But how does CWD make money? Well, it actually threatens all of that. It threatens all of that. We don't receive money because we get CWD. I think that's the question. There's competitive grant dollars, and competitive being the key word. So if USDA has some money to do research or CWD mitigation, then states could submit a proposal for funding for that proposal. In the case of Louisiana, that's allowed us to purchase incinerators to burn up the heads after we collect samples. It's allowed us to purchase coolers that hunters can access to drop samples off in parts of Northeast Louisiana. It's allowed us to cover some of the costs, but not all of the costs of diagnostic sampling. So at the end of the day, we have received federal money from USDA because, to respond to CWD, but very specific. And so when it purchases incinerator, when it purchases, it's purchasing things that you need to mitigate and manage the disease. You wouldn't have needed it if you weren't looking for it. And even the testing, it doesn't pay necessarily for all of our diagnostic costs, but it pays for a lot of it. And what in turn do? We offer testing to the public at no cost. So we've never, we haven't charged people to test for CWD. There's a mechanism at which people can pay the lab to have their deer tested. But if you would like to have your deer tested, there's drop-off coolers in Northeast. You can bring a sample to a regional office, ask to have your deer sampled, and it'll be sampled at no cost. And those are the things that we do. But some of the money received offsets that. At the end of the day, CWD has increased our expenditures towards something that we otherwise would not have to expend, and they're not even covering all of it. So as an agency, now we're having to divert funds from other things to help surveil and manage CWD. And granted, we do get some funding to offset some of that expense, but not all of it. We would be better off not getting any of offsetting funds and not having to spend $1 on CWD. That would be more advantageous financially to any business. If something's only going to offset a portion of your business expense, well, if you didn't spend anything on that expense to start with, you're still better off than me giving you 80% of what it costs for you to do something. And that's kind of what's happening. And unfortunately, those funds haven't been available each and every year. We know how federal funding works. It can be here today and gone tomorrow. There were many years where there were no USDA dollars, and there's years at which there have been. But none of them come in the form of a blank check that the agency gets and can use it to pay for staff, vehicles, whatever you think you want to pay and do with it. Now you have those monies to do that. No, it's competitive grants. And then you have to, if it's incinerators, you're going to have to purchase incinerators with them, and you're going to have to file a report, and there's going to be, oversight over how that funding was expended. Yeah. And I've never not expended it or recommended expenditures on things that weren't covered in the proposal. So I don't know what would happen if you did that.
We'll see.
But we don't. And
Right.
but that's, I think, a common misconception is that you get CWD and there's $10 million is just going to be sent to your state now from the federal government. And, that in itself would be lucrative enough for folks to make a big deal out of something that's not a big deal. But in our case, what USDA is looking at in the case of those funds is they're trying to help the states unlock, do research, come up with strategies that maybe have been overlooked or not tried before. And if you're relying on states to all of a sudden conduct all of this research independently and having to utilize their same dollars to do so, we're just not going to be able to do a whole lot of that. So without a doubt, there's some research dollars that are expended that benefit researchers. But at the end of the day, it's in response to, a threat that if we did not have, we would be better off financially
Absolutely.
for it. But the bigger impact isn't it's not really the argument of like, well, they get money. I heard the guy say they got money. I told you so. It's more about what can we lose? And, we talked about, it was a 2020 report from Southwick and Associates, and it was done before the last licensing restructure. It had nothing to do with CWD. And I don't know if it's changed. And in the business you're in, you may have a better feel, but retail sales then, and again, it's a survey that they conducted for us, but, we threw those numbers out there, 580 plus million in retail sales, almost 600 then. I don't know what they are now. There's been some inflation obviously since then. And I would argue that we have a few more hunters now than we did then based on our annual hunter harvest survey that looks at the number of hunters that report through our annual survey pursuing deer. So in 2020, we had a little uptick for the first time after trending down. So we basically had a little uptick in 2020. Folks were getting outdoors, getting outside, but it hasn't dropped back. So it's kind of
that was like COVID year. People had to get outside and go do something.
Didn't skyrocket, but there was an increase, and we've kind of maintained that. So the point is, those numbers from 2019 were based on a time at which we actually had a reduced number of efforts and hunters. So if anything, you couple those things with inflation, it's probably significantly more now. So the numbers I'm throwing out and sharing are numbers that we have that we've obtained through a survey, so we can share those because they're published. But it's likely greater than that. I just wanted to share that as it pertained to the economics of deer and deer hunting and the impacts of CWD and the threat that it poses, not just to the wild resource, but the industries tied to it.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. It's so easy for someone. It doesn't matter if it's CWD or anything else when it comes to the political thing or anything. It's so easy for people just to say, well, this is what they're doing with that, whether it's anything monetary or not. Like, here's why they're doing this. And a lot of times it does come back to a financial benefit, whether it's business or government or anything like that. But that is one thing that you hear a lot. I promise, like, for the last several weeks in preparation of this, I feel like every TikTok, YouTube short, Instagram reel, everything that is CWD related, whether positive or negative overall, like their outlook on it, I've watched it. And that's one thing that people, and that's the reason I ask, that's one thing so many people say is, well, they're just throwing all this stuff out there. We don't have the numbers to back it up, but they're just getting all this grant money and they're getting all this money for them to use just for whatever reasons. And so that's why I ultimately asked what I did, is so you could go, just an open-ended question for you to go through everything and say, we're not getting X amount of dollars that I'm buying me a brand new truck with. We're not.
How much of it is because in the state of Louisiana, our history in our state, we have a rich history of everything not being on top of the table.
Yeah, well, I think that's
maybe
everywhere.
A little gun shy.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that those thoughts they're not, they're not justified. I'm not saying that at all.
Not in y'all's department.
Yeah.
I'm just saying in our
You're talking
state
about just like in government. Yeah, just government in general. And again, I think it's not just Louisiana. It's probably everybody that thinks that their government
not
does.
in Washington, D.C.
Well, maybe not there, but
it's not like that.
But you get why I asked the question. I just wanted you to just go and
it's
explain
a great
that.
question, and there's not a simple answer because when you heard me answer it, we didn't receive funds each and every year. It's not a guarantee, and typically it's tied to a project, but the project covers one facet of our response to the disease, and unfortunately, it doesn't cover all of the other expenses. So we're definitely, it's a money losing game for us, but we're not responding to generate income. We're responding to hopefully mitigate spread of the disease, to surveil and determine that, hey, look, it's not in most of these parishes, because we're not only meeting our surveillance goals, but we're exceeding them, and we can't find disease there. And that's the end goal. And folks always ask, what's the end goal? It's like to look hard and not find it, so that you can keep enjoying what you've been enjoying, and that it'll be there for others to enjoy after you. Well, John, that's kind of the end game and goal.
So you kind of touched on it a minute ago. So the purchase of a hunting license in the state of Louisiana, so are we saying they're on the uptick?
Yeah, so that license sales, there was a slight, and we're talking about, and you can't look at just hunting. You have hunting and fishing, but there was a decline, and it wasn't unique to Louisiana. It's kind of national trend in hunters and in hunting license sales, and we did have it's obvious that there was an effect from COVID, and we saw some resurgence, whether it was reactivation, new hunters. There's definitely, you can stratify that data and answer that. I don't have that answer with me right here, but regardless of whether it was reactivation or just new hunters, there was a little bump and increase, and we've maintained that. And
since 2020
is
what you're referring to,
right? And so, and I'm very narrowly focused, because I'm often just focused on the number of hunters reporting that they're deer hunting, and we're utilizing an annual survey that dates back to 1970. So it's probably less important to focus on the actual number, but just look at the trend. Because if you're asking the same questions and you're asking them for 55 years, then the trend's in that answer. And if you're surveying 6% of licensed hunters over a 55-year period of time, and you're looking at your response rate, doesn't mean that if it says there's 239,000 hunters, that there's 239,000 deer hunters. But if we say that we're increasing, we're stable, or we're decreasing, we feel pretty good about that. It's a statistically valid sample, because you're getting thousands of surveys back, and you're basing it. And again, it's an index, but you're just comparing year to year, decade to decade. So when we're talking about that increase, that's one of the key places that I'm referring to. That's where that data is coming from. It's coming from an annual survey. In our case, that dates back to 1970. And there's some unique questions injected into it each year, but for the most part, it's meant to be just a long-term indice where you're just tracking the same variables over time and looking for changes in trend. Granted, the surveys change from mail to email, but that's just a function of, but the questions are the same, and the sample sizes, it's still based on the 6% and still targeting hunters, and that hasn't changed. So at the end of the day, did you deer hunt last year? Yes. And so you're looking, how is that tracked over time?
Well, I know that our bow hunter, some years ago, your average bow hunter was getting awfully old, and there was no new insurgence of archery customers, no young people coming in whatsoever. And it is now. I think that has a lot to do with it. There's more young people now.
Buying bows, shooting bows,
guns too, though. All of it, absolutely.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, it is encouraging that maybe the outdoor lifestyle is now becoming more family oriented. Now, maybe I don't know, but I do know there's an uptick in the archery part of it. It's not an opinion. We see it. So I don't know.
What bow are this uptick of generation of archers? What bows are they coming in and buying?
Well, it doesn't make any difference for this argument. I'm not throwing somebody's bow out there, but a spotted dog bow. That's what it is.
There you go.
From Spotted Dog.
You know what I think people get so just pissed about when it comes to CWD more than anything else is not being able to feed. I may be wrong on that, but I just feel like when you get down to the culprit of why people absolutely hate the thought of any kind of regulation. I mean, people came out of the woodworks when y'all dropped a feed ban, because it started off just in Tensall, didn't it?
Yeah.
And then it grew to.
Correct. So,
Well, it was almost in Union Parish.
yeah,
Well, it was
so-
temporarily.
What's
Correct.
okay?
And Morehouse, I'm about to let you talk about Morehouse Parish too. Like there's been the temporary, 4 years ago, over around.
So Morehouse and
Rouge.
Union was 2021, and that was in response to the detection of the disease in Union County, Arkansas.
Right.
So
Okay.
since
it was
that
Arkansas.
time, though, since that time, we've tested more than 1,000 deer on the Louisiana side within 25 miles, and Arkansas has tested. I don't know what the latest numbers are, but they've tested as many, if not more. And they've only had one additional detection there. So that's actually very fortunate that in a 4-year period, you've only detected 2 positives. And both of those positives, unfortunately, they're on a refuge, but that refuge in general, they're doing probably a pretty good job of trying to manage both deer numbers, and obviously baiting and feeding has never been allowed there. So so on that particular refuge, despite the fact that there's been a couple of positives, no additional detections beyond on either side. So that is encouraging. But to your point, 2021, very first for Union Morehouse. But if we go back to the original control area, that was 2018, and it wasn't a distance. It was parishes. It was East Carroll, it was Madison, and it was Tensall Parish. And it was in response to Mississippi's very first detection in East Sequinta County. So think Vicksburg area, just for a simplification for the geography of it all. And, in response to it, they continued to test, and we tested on our side. And at that time, we tested a number of animals within 25 miles of that positive, and we evenly distributed those samples across that area. So we didn't sample them all from one location. We had to meet a certain surveillance goal based on distance to positive. And at that time, based on the numbers that we tested, the model basically pointed out that we should be 95% confident that if the disease would have been there at 1% prevalence, we would have detected. So that's what we did. And so after 2018, that control area was absolved. 2021, fast forward, Union Morehouse, it was absolved. Next control area was 2022, and it was in response to, what we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, our first detection in Tensall Parish. And, that was 4 years later and slightly south of where we look. So we basically kind of missed where we ended up finding it 4 years later, because we focused on a 25-mile from positive, knowing that if we're going to look, let's look closest to where the disease has been detected, thinking that if it's there, that's where we're most likely to find it.
Yeah.
Well, there's a precedence there. So if it had been lifted,
Yeah, it just hasn't been lifted because each year there's just been additional positives, slightly more than the year before, but geographically it hasn't changed much. And I hate to say things like that because it, as soon as you say it, then it shifts and you find a new hotspot. And so we cautiously say those things, but that's what we're observing right now. But as a result, we've maintained that control area, and it's more or less the same geographic area dating back to 2022. And what the future of that control area is going to look like, will be dependent on what we find moving forward. And again, it'll be up to the discretion of our commission. So our policymakers will, take the information we give them. They'll ask us the hard questions, and from there, they'll decide how to proceed. But
in Union Parish, there was a large sample size up there, wasn't it, brother? There was one or two taken over.
Yeah, Union's typically, and John can speak to this, it's typically either number 1 or 2 in the state for harvest. So it's a high deer harvest parish, and it's not hard to find hunter-harvested samples. You just need a few willing hunters, but there's lots of deer there and lots of deer being harvested.
Well, the state of the state of deer population, the state of Louisiana's deer herd, how are we?
Right now, the important thing is there's not more deer everywhere. You're not seeing, but overall, there's the estimate is probably close to 1 million deer. That's based on population reconstruction. There's certainly a wide range in error there. That's a model that produces an estimate. It's done by statisticians, not by me. And we have variables that they look at, and we provide, the inputs for those variables, and you come up with an estimate. But there are deer in all 64 parishes. We've had mandatory reporting since 2008. There are many parishes right now that are reporting more deer than any other time. Matter of fact, since mandatory reporting began, the highest reported harvest was last season. So we go 24-25 is the highest reported harvest you've had since 2008. The previous high was the year before. So you can kind of talk about where are we heading, where are things trending? Well, there's deer in all 64 parishes. Just have to be cautious in talking about the state of deer because folks are focused on where they're hunting. And while there are some parishes that are killing 2 times and even greater the number of deer than they were in 2008, there's others that are killing half. It's like, well, how's that possible? It's habitat. Habitat's the driver. We've investigated. We had some concerns on one of our coastal parishes and started looking at time-lapse data. And they have a box stand. If you go 10 years ago on Google Earth, you can see a lane leading from it in the marsh. It means it was a shooting lane that somebody was maintaining. 5 years later, the lane's not maintained anymore. And the most recent shot, you could fish around it because it's surrounded by water. It's a metal drill stem tower.
Yeah.
It's an exaggerated example, but it's a point that not everything stays the same. So some of the coastal parishes, there's been loss of habitat, conversion of habitat. There's places in southeast Louisiana where deer were trapped in those coastal parishes to use during restocking efforts between 49 and 69 in Louisiana. Now those same areas are almost void of deer, or maybe the habitat's not even there anymore.
Yeah.
And the other side of it is parishes influenced by just timber markets. So you had hardwood, pulpwood mill closures in parts of the south and southeast Louisiana. And now all of a sudden, timber harvest has all but ceased in parishes. And you look at a parish like Iberville or West Baton Rouge, their harvest has tremendously decreased. They had one of the highest harvest rates in the state, where we're talking about harvest per forested acre, when tagging began in 2008. And now those harvest rates have greatly diminished. But at the end of the day, when you quit cutting hardwood, if you quit cutting trees in hardwood forest, things, canopy, shade, deer are reliant on understory plants for nutrition. That is what drives deer populations. It's their diet.
So go ahead.
No, but that, so the example there is like, it's really site specific. And that's why we have so many deer areas, and some deer areas have a more conservative bag than others. Some of the areas we're talking about fall in deer area 9. You still have limited either sex days there. You still have limited either sex days in deer area 5, which is the Atchafalaya Basin. The least productive marsh we have, and I'm not saying it least productive, but where deer habitat has diminished due to changes is in deer area 9. So it's not great everywhere, and it's probably it would definitely probably strike a nerve with some hunters if we say that, man, look, we've had the second record harvest. I'm the last person that wants to put a news release out about that. Our folks will want to put it, and I'm like, no, please don't, because it strikes a nerve with folks who aren't experiencing success.
Right.
And it's a generalization, and it's not an absolute, meaning it's not happening everywhere.
Yeah.
But that's the reality. But deer have saturated our state. There are places that we grew up where even I'm not that old of a guy where there were no deer that there are deer now. There's reported deer harvest in all 6. Orleans Parish reported deer harvest. Lafayette Parish reported deer harvest. There's deer harvested in all 64 parishes, meaning deer are everywhere now. And you go back 100 years ago, we don't know how many deer there were, but the estimates were there were 25,000 deer. There's that many deer in some of the parishes we have now, so it's gone so far in 100 years. So it just depends on the context that's wrapped around it. But what I would say, just a simplification, is we're killing as many deer now as we've had since mandatory reporting began. When you look at our estimate of harvest, that's based on that survey we talked about that dates back to 1970. We're pretty close to all-time highs, not just since tagging, but all time. And we're killing deer in every parish, and deer are very widespread. But there's certainly areas where deer are not doing as well as others. And the underlying factor in this case isn't a disease. It's not feeding or not feeding. It's simply tied to changes in habitat that aren't favorable for deer. So when their nutritional plane declines and the forage quality, both quantity and quality, diminishes, then their fitness, their reproductive output, their recruitment, all of those things follow that same effect. They're also following that same decline. Thus, there's fewer deer, and your removable surplus at that point is also reduced. You can't support the same level of harvest when you have an animal that has a reduced reproductive rate and their offspring have reduced survival rates. You're not going to be able to sustain the harvest in Iberville Parish that you had in 2008. The fitness of the animals will not allow for it.
You don't see the 2 fawns per doe,
Yeah, and again, it's kind of an oversimplification, but it's just to share the point that there's definitely some areas that and none of those things are forever. Habitat loss, that tower that once had a box stand on it that's in open water. Well, yeah, that's an extreme example. That's just meant for story and just for conversation. But we don't know what the future in Iberville. There could be an emerging market. It may not be for pulpwood. It may make some type of fuel out of hardwood pellets. It may power something in 10 or 20 years. There may be a plant there that wants every pulpwood stick that they can get from within 90 miles just to fuel the plant. So what will deer and deer hunting be like then? I'll be retired, but whoever's there, they'll build a statue of them because it's like, deer are back. Great that Bordelon's gone because we weren't killing anything 20 years ago when he was deer program manager. So that's the reality. So the good thing is there's no inevitable, that isn't a permanent problem. It does have the potential to improve. It just is going to require something to change the dynamic there in the form of disturbance from, and you can't have a one time. You can have a hurricane and you can have a little blip, and some recovery and some improvement in habitat. But when you're talking about, decades long harvest success and sustaining increased harvest rates requires regular intervals and disturbance of habitat, forested habitat to perpetuate that. So, that again, just something to share. I think often, we kind of lose sight of the fact that we're not all in the same boat. We're all hunting the same deer, but, the direction, some folks are definitely paddling against the current just because, and it's things they have no control over.
All right.
So that is, and that is a tremendous challenge. because at that point it becomes more about managing expectations. And there are some things you can do as a smaller landowner or landowner, regardless of size, to enhance your property. You can cut and harvest trees even if they're not being sent to a mill. That's not financially advantageous. It costs money to do that. You can increase the size of wildlife plantings. You can mulch some habitat to set it back to get more sunlight on the ground. But again, all of those things cost money, and you can't just do them once. You have to be able to, perpetuate that disturbance, and that can become pretty costly. And it's, hopefully, new technologies and emerging markets can maybe counter, some of the pulpwood, hardwood loss, just because that commodity is no longer sought after, and there's no longer a mill to receive it in certain areas. Maybe it can help those areas.
Yeah. Well,
we need to find something to perpetuate the timber.
Yeah.
We need it.
Well, I have 1,000 more questions, but you have a long drive back to South Louisiana. You said
you're driving back tonight. Are you really?
Yeah.
We got an early day of work.
Is that staying with Hanks?
I could, but I'm going to get back. I'm fine. I'm just happy to be able to talk about deer this long.
He said John's not a good snuggler. He said he kicks. He ain't doing that. You said walking in, you're like, I think you told him that we're probably going to run for a while or something like that. And, maybe so much that we'll do a part 2. We're going to roll all of this into one episode, but I was looking down at some of the notes I had, and I'm like, man, I really don't feel like we even touched some of the information, some of the questions that people I've talked to have had and that I've had, and some things I want to talk about. So we're going to get you back on, but it's almost 9:00 and you got a long ways to drive back south. So, is there anything, I'm going to open it up to you, and I'm going to give you a chance as the black bear man if there's anything you want to say, regarding that. But is there anything at all? We've asked a ton of questions. Is there anything at all that you want to say that we haven't asked?
No, I just appreciate the opportunity. And at the end of the day, hopefully folks looking at, the interview or at least the questions tonight realize that we're all in this together, that some of the challenges that we discussed, whether it's disease, whether it's habitat issues, those are all things that we're cognizant of. We recognize that, those are challenges for hunters and certainly challenges for our deer herd. And those are things that we're focused on and committed to. And just know that we're here to assist, but more important, we're also here to listen. So we are accessible to the public. We field calls and emails each and every day and encourage people to reach out, because often we're not aware of what's happening in your backyard unless you make us aware of it. So certainly, increase your communication with their agency or your local office. We have 6 field offices in Louisiana, Mendon, Monroe, Pineville, Lake Charles, Lafayette, and Hammond. So depending on where you are, reaching out, talking to a biologist, talking to them about issues you have on your property. There may be some things that we can help you with, or some ideals we can give you, or we can maybe put you in touch with folks that can assist. That's just the importance of increased communication. And tonight was, certainly a great opportunity to speak and talk to a lot of folks who we otherwise may not have gotten the chance to share some stories with.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, people, your voice, it is heard, and you got a man right here, him and his team, they're ready to listen. So,
I enjoyed that. It was eye-opening, really.
Yeah.
Glad I came down here to be a part of it.
I'm glad I bribed you getting away from that bow shop to come on down.
I appreciate that.
You still ain't going to tell me what bow everyone's buying these days?
Man, it's a Hoyt.
Michael's listening right now. Y'all are watching this on that Thursday. This drops, and you're sitting there, and he just said that up on the TV, or you just said that, and it went up there on the TV back there in the pro shop. Michael, he's just laughing, kind of under breath, rolling his eyes. He's like, that liar.
Yeah.
It's a Matthews, that liar. So, all right, what about you? Is there anything before we wrap this puppy up?
Well, you've got your Bear Wise sticker there in front of you. So just, anybody
I'm going to get you to hold him up while you talk.
That wants to, has any, want to know a little bit more about bears, go to bearwise.org. It's the same information, whether you're Florida or Maine or Tennessee or Louisiana. And it's all about bears all the time, kind of what they're doing right now, or you're having issues, what you can do, or maybe you're traveling somewhere for vacation where there's going to be bears and you don't have much bear experience. Certainly can get on our website and look for bear stuff, but you're also going to have to go through deer and oysters and alligators. Bearwise.org is bear all the time. And again, we're available on the telephone. We talk to people every day, and we have a lot of other biologists that are very knowledgeable that work for us. So if you've got a question, instead of guessing or so-and-so said, give us a call. And sometimes I might not have the answer, but I might be able to say, hey, Johnathan, I think you need to talk to this guy. He's, or he may send it to somebody else, but we'll do the best to help you. You do the same things you do. We talked a couple of days ago about this, and we were both killing a wasp and cutting limbs around deer stands.
Right.
I mean, we're not any different than anybody else.
Yeah. Well, cool.
You know what's going to happen?
Lay it on
It's
me.
going to make us a better bow hunter or a better hunter, period. You're going to have to, oh my gosh, I got to go find deer sign.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I got a lot of deer sign around a corn feeder.
That's a big part of what
But get out
we'll
there
get into
underneath
next time.
Well, remember
find a
that
trail.
the Tensas Parish harvest increased after the bait ban was implemented.
Yep. And that's, again, that's part of the things that we're going to get into next time. We don't have time to even open that can right now. But next time, whether it's here, Marouge, Tensas, Kansas, the last 3 to 4 years, I've noticed it time and time again.
So it's a tease.
It's a little tease.
Little
I don't know.
tease.
We may not be able to bribe him back up.
No, I'll be
But
back.
next time he's going to come up, we're going to go eat supper. So,
We still might go eat supper here in just a minute. I'm hungry. Those duck wraps
man,
off my
I got a
shirt smell
grandbaby.
good
He's
while
at my
ago.
house. I'm going to go see him.
So, all right. Well, guys, thank you so much for making the time to come. I know you're all busy.
Well, thanks for having us, and we appreciate this, and we're happy to come back.
Yeah. Well, and LDWF, if you've even stayed and listened to this part, thank you for always being open and sharing all of your resources with us. It seems like every time that we ask for something, they are right there, whatever y'all need.
Not said no.
Yeah. So
And
we appreciate that.
that.
Yep.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, good deal. We'll check out SpottedDogSportingGoods.com. So this will drop Thursday. So that means most of you were sitting in a stand yesterday, October 1st, Wednesday. And hopefully a lot of you busted old Slickhead and dropped her off and got some deer meat headed to the freezer here soon.
So CWD free.
CWD free.
Deer meat.
Yeah, that's it. All right. Thank you, guys. Check out, if I didn't say it just then, check out SpottedDogSportingGoods.com for all your hunting and fishing needs. So that's free shipping over $99 or more.
You slacking.
I'm always slacking. All right. Thank you, guys. See you guys next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.